What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back for another discography ranking. It's not been that long since we've done one. Actually, 2 weeks ago we had just done Slayer, but I figured since when I did that poll asking from you guys what band you wanted to see me cover for a discography ranking, it was kind of close between Slayer and this band, and I thought, well, since this band almost got it, how about I throw those people a bone and I'll do a discography ranking for this band? And that band we are talking about this time around is one of the best black metal bands to ever come out, and that is, of course, Darkthrone. Now, going through a lot of these albums, it's very interesting to hear how Darkthrone, they pretty much do whatever the hell they want, and they've been everything from death metal, black metal, punk, doom, classic metal. Like, those are like the 5 main schools you really get a lot of the music from when it comes to Darkthrone's overall discography. Now, as far as when I got into Darkthrone a little bit later than most people. I think I got into this band slowly but surely over time since about, I want to say 2014. Like, I got into black metal pretty late because I just wasn't sure if I would like it, but now I do like a little bit of black metal, and this band I think stands above pretty much all or most of the Norwegian bands. Like, I would put a lot of their albums ahead of even albums from Mayhem and Immortal and so on and so forth. Not quite the best Norwegian black metal band. I think that title, to my ears, still goes to Emperor, but Darkthrone would be a close second because, like I said, there's just such a diversity in their discography. So, with all that said, let's talk about the history of the band. So, we are getting started here in 1986 when they originally formed as a death metal band called Black Death, and their original lineup consisted of Ivar Enger on rhythm guitars, and he would later be known by the stage name Zephyrus, Anders Risberget on lead guitars, Dag Nilsson on bass, and Gilv Fenris Nagel, who is Fenris, and that's why he's going to be known for the rest of this video. And he was, of course, writing lyrics, playing drums, and doing vocals. However, later in '86, they would change their name to Darkthrone, and good decision on their part, because that's a high-quality name. It sounds evil and metal as fuck, and that's what you really want to go for, at least at the time, being a death metal band, have something a little dark and a little sinister sounding. So this lineup would last until sometime in 1988, where Anders would leave, and would be replaced by one Ted Arvid Skellum, later known as Nocturno Culto, and he would take over on lead guitars and take over on vocals from Fenris. They would do some live gigs here and there in the Norwegian metal scene, and really started to get a buzz through some demo recordings, and eventually got picked up by Peaceville Records, and in 1990 they began recording their debut album, which would then be released in 1991, and that is Soulside Journey. Now, when it comes to most of this discography, this album is very, very different from everything else that you're going to hear in Darkthrone's entire catalog, because this is not black metal. This is death metal, because at the time, Darkthrone was really into the whole Swedish death metal scene. And in fact, Uffe Sutherland from Entombed actually came in and helped co-produce the album with one Thomas Skogsberg. However, Uffe did all the guitar production while Thomas did the production for everything else, and that's why the tone kind of has a little bit of that Entombed influence. Now, as far as where this ranks, this is my number 5 album. I love death metal. I'll just go ahead and say it. I love death metal much more than I do black metal. I still do like black metal, but this album, I think, is one of the most underrated albums in the history of not just extreme metal, but metal as a whole, because of the fact that it sounds so different from everything else that they did. Like, it's still pretty raw, after all, recorded at Sunlight Studios, where you was hearing that HM2 tone, and you got that on this album. Musically, though, it's a little more technical than some of the Swedish death metal bands. After all, Nocturno admitted in an interview that one of the biggest inspirations he had when it came to the songwriting on the guitars for this album was Death's Scream Bloody Gore album, and that was why the lead work on this album is so Death-inspired, and these were, even Nocturna said, the most structured solos that the band ever had. And of course the drum work, like, Fenriz is not known for technical drumming, and as we get along with the rest of the discography, you'll hear that more minimalist approach, but he really is flying all over the drum kit, playing all sorts of stuff, mostly thrashy beats and like mid-tempo stomps. But yeah, songs like Sunrise Over Locust Mortis, Cromlick, the title track, Neptune Towers, The Watchtower, Sempiternal Sepulchrality, and Accumulation of Generalization. That and Aeon, the two instrumentals on this album, amazing instrumentals. And I love how on Aeon you get these like dark, almost opera vocals to kind of help add more darkness to the song. But overall, this is, I think, a definition of a death metal hidden gem, at least in my opinion. However, this sound would be very short-lived, because not too long after this album came out, the Norwegian black metal scene was really starting to blow up as Mayhem was getting big in the scene. Other bands would start coming in like Enslaved, Immortal, Emperor, among many others. And also Fenriz was starting to pal around with Euronymous from Mayhem and started to ingrain himself into the whole scene, and pretty much got almost everybody in Darkthrone on board with being a part of this scene. Like I said, most of them, because the one that didn't was Dag, the bassist. He wasn't really big on moving to black metal. However, he stayed on to do the session bass for this next album because, well, this next album was going to sound completely different than what they did for Soulside Journey. Now, according to Fenriz on an interview, he said that when they eventually sent the final tapes to Peaceville called them and said, "What the fuck is this?" And Fenriz is like, "This is black metal." And they're like, "Well, we signed you as a death metal band. What are you doing?" And Fenriz was kind of falling into that mindset of Euronymous of not liking death metal, what if they thought what it was becoming, and said, "Well, this is what we want to do. If you don't want to release it, then we'll release it on Euronymous' label, Death Like Silence Productions." However, Peaceville at least tried to get them to remix the album, but Fenriz said, "No, this is what black metal is supposed to sound like." And then Peaceville finally caved in and said, "Okay, we'll release this thing." And actually, 30 years ago on this month, in March of 1992, Darkthrone releases their second album, Ablaze in the Northern Sky. This is my #1 album. I kind of knew it would be when I was going into checking out a lot of this discography, because I think in terms of overall black metal albums, this is top 3, 4, top 5 at the very least. I would even rank this higher than Mayhem's De Mysteria Stomp Satanas. Even though I love that album to death, I think Ablaze in the Northern Sky is a little bit better, because these songs loaded with dynamics, and even though Fenriz said there was still some remnants of the death metal influence on here, mainly in a few of the riffs as well as the songwriting structures, but in terms of the atmosphere, it got cold, dark, grim, and it fit perfectly. And the production was still pretty good for what it was. It was definitely much more raw than Soulside Journey, but it kind of had a bit of like that old school 70s rock feel in the production. But I mean, top to bottom, only 6 songs, but all 6 songs are amazing. Catharian Life Code, and The Shadow of the Horns, Paragon Belial, Where Cold Wind Blows, the title track, and The Pagan Winter. Like, every song, just dynamics, amazing riffs, great blast beats, some doomy foot stomping stuff here and there, some nice mid-tempo grooves, like some Celtic Frost vibes and Bathory vibes kind of commingling together, and that's how we get to this album. And also the vocals, I love the vocal style on this album. Like, Nocturno is just projecting the shit out of his vocal cords during this album. So this would be the beginning of what is known as the Unholy Trinity. And, well, you're going to find out where I ranked the other two in just a moment. So, but another thing to note about Ablaze in the Northern Sky, melodies were definitely amped up on the album, more in like that old school 70s rock kind of vibe within the production. So yeah, more melodies coming in, and that's all I can really say. So, like I said, Ablaze in the Northern Sky would be the beginning of what is known as the Unholy Trinity. Now, after Ablaze in the Northern Sky was released, Dag officially left the band, and now they are a three-piece band. And for this next album, Nocturno would actually play the bass and do the vocals, while Zephyrus did all the guitars and Fenris doing the drums and the lyrics. And released in 1993, and actually before we get to the release, after Ablaze in the Northern Sky came out, Peaceville, at first they were hoping the album would have done bad, and then they were like, oh, maybe it'll do bad and they'll go back to playing death metal. But once Ablaze in the Northern Sky picked up steam and sold a lot for Peaceville Records, Peaceville, and after a while of actually getting used to the sound and starting to dig it, they're like, okay, now we see what you was talking about with how black metal is supposed to sound like. We actually want you to do another one. And this time, because Darkthrone doesn't tour, Fenris said they had 1 whole year to do only black metal, because, like they said, there were still remnants of death metal on Ablaze in the Northern Sky. So here they were going to write what they were going to call pure black metal. And released in 1993, we get Under a Funeral Moon. Now, there's 2 different shifts that happen here, the production and the style. The production, even more raw than Ablaze in the Northern Sky, and then the style, less of the mid-tempo, doomy foot stomp and stuff. I mean, you get it here and there on a couple of tracks. This is more about just playing blazingly fast with the steady blast beat and the staticky guitars. And definitely the vocals get a little more out of control. As far as where I rank this album, I rank it at number 8. However, I will say, in terms of songwriting, there are albums that come behind this album that I prefer. However, this and the next album that we'll talk about, I appreciate it for the atmosphere, and that's really what you listen to this and the next album for, is more the atmosphere. As Norwegian black metal at this point, it was supposed to sound ugly and awful and scare you. And this and the next album you could kind of put in the background and creep people out. But there are some really good songs on this album, like Dance of Eternal Shadows, which has a couple of great doomy foot-stomping moments, especially in the beginning of the song. Crossing the Triangle of Flames, the title track, To Walk the Infernal Fields. Like, not a bad song on this album per se. I will say the production is definitely something that outsiders looking in are going to have to get used to, because it's really raw, and the vocals get a little bit goofy, but overall I appreciate this album for what it was designed to do, and that was to creep people out and build on atmosphere. So that's where I put Under a Funeral Moon at number 8. Now, after Under a Funeral Moon came out, Zephyrus would leave the band, and that would leave us down to the gruesome twosome of Nocturno Culto and Fenris left in the band, and now we are done naming members because it's just down to those guys. So after Under a Funeral Moon came out, the band went right back to the studio, and for this next album, they recorded it on a 4-track in Fenris's bedroom. And it definitely sounds like it, and released in 1994, we get the third and final part of the Unholy Trinity, and that is Transylvanian Hunger. Yeah, this is definitely the band's most well-known album, most famous album, and, well, this album's my number 9. I do enjoy the atmosphere behind it, however, I can understand some people's opinions that it might be a bit too repetitive, and, like, the sound, it does kind of stay in one place, which is that steady blast beat and tremolo chords being played for almost 40-plus minutes. Yeah, it's like, if you're looking for diversity in the songwriting, this may not be for you. But if you're looking for raw, cold, atmospheric black metal, this is definitely going to be right up your alley. Like, these tremolo riffs are fast, yet precise, yet they kind of stay in the same place, and then really, yeah, I can understand how playing the same blast beat can drive people insane, but this album goes for a certain feel, which is what I think people like about it. Maybe not so much for the songwriting, but more for the atmosphere. But there are a couple of really good songs on here, like the title track has Flittermice Satan Spies, Graven Taka Heman Sailor, I believe that's how you say it, or Salar. Because then again, the song titles and the lyrics got way more Norwegian on this, so I will suffer for that. But yeah, the reason why I don't have these two albums ranked higher like a lot of people do is because I think there are other albums that are better than this in terms of black metal, or just better songwriting overall. But I do respect these two albums. I do have them ranked in the top 10, but I will admit there are some albums that will come behind it that I think were better in terms of songwriting. But after the release of Transylvanian Hunger, Darkthrone would, I don't remember if they left or got dropped off by Peaceville Records, and they would eventually sign to Moonfog Productions, which was a label started up by Satyr from Satyricon, because Satyricon and Darkthrone had become really close friends over this time period. And after Transylvanian Hunger came out, the band went back to the studio in Fenris's bedroom, and as far as musical influence, according to Fenris, going into this next album, the main inspirations were Celtic Frost, Bathory, and Vader. Specifically, Morbid Tales, Under the Sign of the Black Mark, and Vader's Necrolust demo, which is old and raw, but that would make sense why they would like it, because they were after the more raw, nasty-sounding stuff. And released in 1995, we get Panzerfaust. This is another fantastic album from Darkthrone. In fact, it's my number 4. Because I will say, in terms of songwriting, this album blows 2/3 of the Unholy Trinity completely out of the water, because it moved away from just being all about playing the steady blast beats over and over, and there's more mid-tempo and even some doomy stuff. Like the Celtic Frost influence is all over this album, especially on songs such as The Hordes of Nebula, which probably is my favorite song of the album, Beholding the Throne of Might, and Quintessence. You do also get a couple of songs that kind of carry on the steady blast beat, like Triumphant Gleam, and I can never pronounce the first song correctly, but I'm going to try my best on it because I don't know Norwegian. In Vind av Sorg, I believe. I believe that's how you say it. And then also Hans Sist Vinter had some of those moments in there, but they're broken up by more of the mid-tempo parts. And then, yeah, the closing track, Snoag Gronskog, might be a bit of a weird way to kind of close the album with that, like, Fisher-Price horn and percussion and Norwegian spoken word by Fenris. But I guess they were just looking for something creepy to put on at the end just to freak people out. But overall, love this album for that Celtic Frost vibe going on and some of that Bathory influence. And that was the thing I really latched on to with it. So after Panzerfaust was released, the band would go back to the studio, and then for this next album, as far as lyrics go, they kind of outsourced a lot of this stuff. The lyrics were either written by Fenris or written by Garm from Ulver, Arcturus, and Borknagar, Isan from Emperor, and Satyr from Satyricon. Now, in terms of the timeline here, this was kind of a busy time for Fenris because he was in a lot of different projects at this point, including Neptune Towers, which was more of a dark ambient project, Isengard, which was a more folk metal project, Storm, which was a project he had with Satyr, and Dod Heimsgard. So Fenris was really busy during the mid-90s. And released in early 1996, we get Total Death. I have this ranked as my number 11 album. I think it's a pretty good album for the most part. However, it's middle of the road in terms of overall Darkthrone because there were a couple of songs where it just didn't feel like a whole lot happened. But there was quite a few songs on this album I absolutely liked. Especially the songs Earth's Last Picture, Black Winged, Blasphemer, especially Blasphemer because of the more thrashy influence, like it kind of reminds you of early Sodom. Gather for Attack on the Pearly Gates, Black Victory of Death was cool. But my favorite would be the opening track, Earth's Last Picture, because again, that Celtic Frost vibe comes in. And also what makes this album, I think, kind of stand apart from the other albums in the 90s was the production was a lot more polished than the last three, for sure, but not polished. Like, it was still raw and gritty as fuck. But overall, and also even the song Majestic Desolate Eye, while that song is too short, I have to agree with Shredlord from Thralls of Metal. It does have a little bit of like a Faith No More riff in there, and I liked it for that reason. So I don't think there's a bad song on this album. There were a couple that felt like, they maybe could have trimmed the fat on it a little bit. But for the most part, I thought this was a pretty good album, and I actually might pick this one up because I didn't think it was bad. But yeah, middle of the pack in terms of Darkthrone, but still a pretty damn good album. Now, because of Fenris being in all these projects, they decided to actually take a break after Total Death came out. However, later in '96, Moonfog wanted to release another album from Darkthrone as to help try and keep their momentum going. So Fenris decided, well, he and Nocturno decided, well, we have all these old demos of what would have been our second album had we continued on as a death metal band, and these demo instrumental tracks were recorded in '91. However, sometime in '94, Fenris decided to just, why not add vocals to these demo tracks. And despite what you might think about hearing a female vocalist on this next album, you didn't. It's Fenris. Yeah, lots of pitch shifting, and it was very weird. But released in the second half of 1996, we get Goat Lord. This is my dead last album. This is my number 19. I just think... I don't know what to make of it, per se, because I do want to give it a break on the production because it's just a demo recording. However, I think adding vocals to these tracks was a big mistake because Fenris's black metal vocals, at least here, were not that great. And then, of course, the high-pitched female pitch-shifting vocals were stupid. Some of the spoken word parts are cool, but the only thing that saves this from being a god-awful album is that while the production, because it's a demo, is muddy and murky, there are a lot of really fucking good riffs on here. Like, musically, this kind of harkens a little bit back to Death and even a little Autopsy in the riff writing. Like songs like The Grimness of Which Shepherds Mourn, As Desert Shadows, Green Cave Float. There are amazing riffs on this album, but again, just buried under mud and terrible vocals and just not mixed well. So that's the reason why this is dead last. It's not a god-awful pile of music, but it's just... if this album could have been remixed and done properly and gotten the proper vocal style, I think this could have been a very good album, but it wasn't. It's not awful, it's not good, it's average at best. And that's only because of the muddiness and the vocal style, but you do get some awesome fucking riffs on this album, so there you go. But like I said, they decided to take a little break after Total Death came out because, well, mainly Fenris was just burnt out because he was in so many other projects. But they would return to the studio in 1998, and released in 1999, we get Ravishing Remnants. This is my number 7 album. I really, really, really like this album. Let me get a drink of water real quick. But yeah, one of my all-time favorite Darkthrone songs, at least especially as of recent, Claws of Time. Like, I gotta thank Necrotic Nick from Thralls of Metal for getting me into this album more, because prior to watching their Darkthrone discography ranking, I didn't really listen to this album. Then once I listened to it, it's like, holy shit, I can see why most of the Thralls guys really loved it. Like, the production definitely stepped up, which didn't have to take much to step up over Goat Lord. I love the gritty guitar tone on this album. Other songs like, yeah, Claws of Time, I agree, it kind of has this like awesome tremolo riff, and then it gets into a little bit of like Venom worship, but with like Motorhead energy mixed with that cold atmosphere. But other great songs like Lifeless, Across the Vacuum, the title track I really like, The Beast is a cool song. And I forgot to mention that with this album, it was Nocturno who wrote all the music, except for one song, which was The Beast, which was written by Fenris. But Fenris wrote all the lyrics, so... yeah, I love the guitar tone on this album. The bass was a little more prominent than it was on Goat Lord, for damn sure. The only thing I could really find to complain about this album is the drum work was maybe a little too minimalistic. Like, yeah, not very many notable fills on here, like Fenris was just sticking to the beat. But love the songwriting, and I love this album. Definitely, I would recommend you guys check it out. My number 7. So after Ravishing Grimness came out, the band went back to the studio in 2000, and once again, Nocturno was in charge of writing all the music, except for one song which was still co-written by him. Fenris all the lyrics, and released in 2001, we get Plague Wielder. This one's my number 16 album, and I'll admit, like, it's not that great, but I don't think it's a bad album. There are some really good riffs, solid vocal performance, and drum work. Definitely the drum work, from when I listened to it, had more fills going on than it was on Ravishing Grimness. The guitar tone, it got a little bit heavier, but in terms of songwriting, it just kind of felt a little like more of the same, kind of. Like, not a whole lot really jumps out, except for maybe the opening track and I Void Hanger. Like, those songs I think are like the standouts on here, but not really too much else. But I do like the tone of the album, but just not a whole lot of memory to it, I would say. So that was kind of one of the issues. It's just only a couple of songs stood out and others not so much. Though, like I said, the drum work was improved on here. I like the guitar tone. But other than that, it's just kind of a there album. And that's why it ranks as my number 16 overall. So, yeah, there you go. But after Plague Wielder came out, the band went back to the studio in late 2002, and for this one, the writing was split between Nocturno and Fenris, and in 2003, we would get the release of Hate Them. I have this one at number 15. It's a little bit better than Plague Wielder, however, I do think that some of the songs on here kind of sounded the same, except for a couple of songs, like Divided We Stand was a cool song, but the two best songs, Fucked Up and Ready to Die and Striving for a Piece of Lucifer, those were great songs, especially Fucked Up and Ready to Die, because again, that Celtic Frost influence would come through. Same with Striving for a Piece of Lucifer and Divided We Stand. But other than that, a lot of these songs just didn't really catch my attention, so to speak, and not my favorite, really. But 3 tracks stood out. The others weren't bad, but they weren't that great. So, yeah, that's why it ranked as my number 15. Now, after Hate Them came out, the band decided to go back to the studio once again for this next album. And for this next album, it was actually a tribute to Corthon from Bathory, who passed away earlier in 2004. And also for this next album, Fenris would actually do some vocals on a couple of tracks, along with Apollyon from Immortal and R Noir. Now, in terms of the pantheon of the Darkthrone discography, this was the last one to be predominantly black metal, because this was when we started to hear the shift with punk and classic metal kind of coming in a little bit. But in terms of like overall full-on black metal, this was the last one, and it started to disappear. And also, this album was leaked about 5 months before it came out, which I would imagine irritated the band. But released in late 2004, we get Sardonic Wrath. This is my number 10 album. I think this was a massive improvement over Hate Them and Plague Wielder for damn sure. I like how, especially after watching some behind-the-scenes footage, I just love the raw spirit of it. I felt like this was a proper return to the raw Darkthrone of the early black metal days, like Blaze in the Northern Sky. And I love how you're getting more of the kind of like the good balance between the steady blast beats and like the mid-tempo grooves and doomy nods. Some really good songs on here like Hate is the Law, Straightening Sharks in Heaven. I always forget the name of this one song. Let me actually look it up because I cannot pronounce it or even remember it off the top of my head. Mon Tinker Seat. That song I really, really liked because it kind of has a riff that sounds like an early Opeth riff, which I really latched on to with that. And also this album started bringing in more nods to bands like Judas Priest and Iron Maiden a little bit. So, yeah, while middle of the pack once again, very good album right here. Like I said, a massive step up from the last two for damn sure, at least in my mind. However, after this album came out, the band went back to the studio in 2005, and they had a different sound in mind coming up. This is where we start into the punk era of Darkthrone. So, during this time period, the band was really into like hardcore punk and crust punk bands like Discharge and Doom at this point. So they kind of wanted to mix that with a bit of a Black End style, but not full-on black metal. And they actually would go back, I believe, I'll need to double check that before I continue further. I probably should have just done my research for this. Yes, this was actually their first album back on Peaceville Records since Transylvanian Hunger. So they left Moonfog and went back to Peaceville, and released in 2006 is The Cult Is Alive. This one's my number 18 album. It's second to last. It was a harsh transition, I think, because yeah, like the production is very murky on this album. It definitely feels removed from black metal and definitely more on that crust punk stuff, which I don't mind crust punk, but it's not really my bag. And this album definitely was not my bag. Like, there was little hints of the old black metal style. Definitely the vocals changed. They were more shouted with a throaty gurgle behind it. And also and they were also kind of taking a shit on black metal, especially the song Too Old, Too Cold. And yeah, they were getting goofy with some of the song titles. Like, there's a song on this called Shut Up, which doesn't scream black metal, but yeah, hard transition and just not my bag at all. That's why it's number 18 on my list. But after The Cult Is Alive came out, the band actually teased the release of their next album with an EP, their first and only EP, at least up to this point in their history, which was called New Wave of Black Heavy Metal. And it definitely signaled what they were about to do next. And their next album, released in 2007, was FOAD, or otherwise known as Fuck Off and Die. This one's my number 17 album. Like, it was a little bit better than The Cult Is Alive, but still not quite my thing. This album just very uneven in the mix. Like, although when listening to some of the riffs and the beats on this album, I can definitely hear how this would inspire quite a bit of the blackened thrash bands or blackened speed metal bands like Midnight and Hellripper and bands along those lines. And I love both of those bands. So I can definitely hear how they would be into this kind of album, but just not really my thing again. Though the guitar tone I thought was a lot better, and I do prefer the vocals on this album. They definitely sounded, I think, more like Venom than anything else. And a couple of the songs I did enjoy, especially for the more humorous side, like Canadian Metal, which does kind of remind me in the beat, at least, of The Devil Went Down to Georgia. I will agree with Jam and John on that. The Church of Real Metal, although those were fun in terms of the humor, but songs I actually did like on this album were Perverter of the Seven Gates, Wisdom of the Dead, and These Shores Are Damned. I think those are pretty good songs for what they were going for on here. It's just top to bottom, it was just inconsistent and uneven. Not that it's a bad album, it's actually a decent album, it's just, yeah, compared to the other albums, it definitely falls. But after FOAD came out, the band would return to the studio once again, and released in 2008, we would get Dark Thrones and Black Flags. They were continuing into the whole punk style, but here I think you start to hear a little bit more of the classic heavy metal coming in, just a little bit. And this album's actually my number 14. I actually think it's a good album. I think in terms of the more punk-oriented stuff, this is definitely one of the better ones. Massive improvement over FOAD, at least in my mind, because Like, the guitar tone was fun. Yeah, some of the vocals, especially like the clean vocals they were going for, weren't well executed, but it fits what they were going for. It fits what they was going for on this album, and there are some solid songs on this album, like Oath Minus, Blacksmith of the North, Grizzly Trade, Hanging Out in Hager, Launchpad to Nothingness. Those songs I really, really liked. Even the title track, despite it being an instrumental, I really, really liked it. Hiking Metal Punks and Norway in September were goofy, but they're fun. Same with Witch Ghetto. There's some fun songs on this album, and it ranks as my number 14 only because I just like so many of their other albums more, but it's definitely a good album, solid album for sure. If you've been one of those Darkthrone fans that have been hesitant about listening to an album like this, I would give this album a listen. Yeah, warning, the vocals are very goofy and not well done, but the songwriting was definitely amped up, and it was a little more catchy and a little more fun and loose, I would say. After the release of Darkthrones and Black Flags, the band went back to the studio in 2009, and, well, released in 2010, we would get the release of Circle the Wagons. This is actually my number 12 album. I actually think this is a really good album, and I think in terms of the punk stuff, this was definitely the best one, and it's not even that much of a punk album. Like, the classic heavy metal and even speed metal influence really got amped up here, and in fact, Fenris described his album as Darkthrone's own brand of heavy metal speed punk. And you pretty much get all that on this album. Like, so many good songs on this album, like Those Treasures Will Never Befall You. Also, even the songs such as, what the fuck was that one? I always forget. Stylized Corpse. I really like that song because you get a little bit of the old school death metal vibes in some of the riffs. Like, the riff in the beginning is kind of like a Chuck Schuldiner death riff, pretty much. And the whole song, I really, really like it. Other really good tracks on here, like, I always forget the names of these songs for some reason, but other songs like Running for Borders, that was a big one I really liked. Black Mountain Totem, Bron Inte Slotted. I like that song because it brings back a little bit of an old school Iron Maiden vibe. Other songs like even I Am the Graves of the 80s has a little bit of an old school Judas Priest vibe, like 70s Judas Priest. Yeah, I think, and while the clean vocals still weren't the best, they were better used on this album and better performed. Top to bottom, not a bad song on here. I actually am probably going to get this in my collection at some point because it's good music, can't be fun, really good album. I think in terms of the punk era, this was definitely the best one because they got the mix right. Like, the punk influence on this album was more in the drum beats with the D beats, while the riffs were very metal centric, especially classic metal and speed metal riffs. So that was the thing I really latched onto with this album. Now, actually, about a month or two before Circle the Wagons came out, the band was already back into the studio, and goes to show you how quick they're willing to get back to work. Now, for this next album, another big shift in the sound would come. So they pretty much would strip away all of the crust punk influence and really dial up the heavy metal influence. And this was a hell of an idea because they kind of teased that approach with Circle the Wagons. This time around for this next album, they were going to go more full tilt classic metal. And actually for this next one, they would finally get some help in production, as this next album we're going to be talking about was mastered by Jack Control, who's mostly a punk vocalist in a bunch of different punk bands, but he would come in to do the mastering on this album. And released in 2013, we get the Underground Resistance. This is my number 6 album. Holy shit, this is a hell of an album. And yeah, it may not be like the classic Darkthrone stuff, which is what a lot of people hope for each time Darkthrone releases music, but this is riffy fun. There are some amazing riffs on here that harken back to Iron Maiden and Judas Priest again, some Merciful Fate, Agent Steel, little bit of Celtic Frost again. Also, one of my favorite songs that they ever did, Leave No Cross Unturned, is on this album. It's 13 plus minutes of just amazing riffs, almost like Agent Steel and Celtic Frost had a baby, and that was the song that happened, because you got a lot of that like Agent Steel riffing and speed, and even the vocals. Like Fenris doing the clean vocals on that song, and actually wasn't bad. I thought he actually stepped it up in terms of his clean vocals. While it's goofy, I liked it. And then you get into these like get into that like Celtic Frost groove quite a bit on this album. But other really good songs on here like Dead Early, Valkyrie, Come Warfare the Entire Doom, where it starts off doomy and then it gets into a little more of that classic heavy metal up-tempo sound. And that was the thing I latched onto with this album, was the more classic metal tones and riffs. They were able to take riffs that feel like you have heard them before, but do it in their own way and still make them sound fresh. Hell, if I was ranking the best albums of 2013, this would be top 5 easily. This is an amazing album for damn sure. I recommend you guys check it out if you haven't. So this would begin the relationship with Jack Control, who would be doing the mastering on the next couple of albums, and there you go. The band would go back to the studio in the fall of 2015, and they were kind of pretty much stick with the classic heavy metal style, but here they were kind of going to bring back the black metal influence and kind of mesh it with the classic metal tones. And released in 2016, we get Arctic Thunder. This one fell for me a little bit. I actually have this at number 13. There's nothing technically wrong with this album. It's just, I don't know, whenever I heard this, I actually heard this album when it came out, and I think I did a review on this album when it came out in 2016. I've never really been too in love with it, although I love the riffs on this album. They keep on that classic heavy metal style, but with more grit. And I will admit the tone is one of the heaviest guitar tones that Nocturno has ever had. I think the problem I had with this album, it sounded like they were trying a little too hard to get back a little bit to the black metal roots of things, and I think it struggled a little bit for me. But the classic metal tones is what I think saves this album from being average. Like, it's a good album. I'm not saying it's bad. It's actually a good album. It's just, I felt like they were just trying a little too hard getting back to the black metal side of things. That was just my opinion on it. But after Arctic Thunder came out, the band would go back to the studio a couple of years later, and actually Fenris flat out said for this next album, they were going to bring back the riff, which is an interesting way of getting people ensnared. And actually for this next album, not only does Jack Control do the mastering, but they would get somebody else to mix the album entirely. And that was a musician from Burial at Sea and Minsk, and one Sanford Parker. He would come in to do the mix for this next album, and released in 2019, we get Old Star. This is my number 2 album. Holy shit. Bringing back the riff, you absolutely did. This is amazing riffing going on here. Like, old Scorpions, Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead, Celtic Frost again. Top to bottom, this album is just full of cut after cut after cut. Starting off with I Muffle Your Inner Choir with that epic tremolo riff with that like speed metal beat, the D beat once again. And then even into Hardship of the Scots, which is one of my favorite Darkthrone songs of all time. Also because that main riff is a direct lift from AC/DC's Let Me Put My Love Into You, and they turned that riff and turned it into like a doom metal stomping riff. It's so cool. It's one of their catchiest songs they ever did. And then the title track getting a little more doomy again, but also bringing in a little bit of tribal influences in the drums towards the end. Outman, I really like it because, well, the main riff sounds like Megadeth. And I really like the thrash nods that that song had. The Duke of Gloat kind of bringing in that Motorhead influence and being a little more of a speed metal song. And then The Key Inside of the Wall. What an epic closer that was, because it just once again felt like kind of like a mix of old Black Sabbath and Celtic Frost kind of meshed together with how the song starts off with the riff, and then it gets into a little bit of that like speed metal influence, and then it ends off with that classic doom metal sound. Like there's some Candlemass riffs here and there that you'll hear on this album. Like the doom vibe was crushing, and in terms of production, this is one of the best produced albums that they've ever had. Like, the guitar tone is heavy. The drums sound gigantic. Like, Fenris's snare sounds like a shotgun going off. And it's unbelievable. And Nocturno's vocals got better on this album in terms of his black metal shrieks. So, yeah, definitely a good mix of black metal, doom, and classic metal with a little speed metal thrown in there, too. And that was the thing I really liked about it. My number 2. But after this album, they would actually go back to the studio a year later, and actually for this next one, they actually went to a completely different studio and actually had people actually produce the album. This would actually be the first time that they've had other people produce their albums since the early 90s. I can't remember if it was either Ablaze in the Northern Sky or Under a Funeral Moon, if they had any actual producers or if it was just them. But released in 2021, so this album just not even a year old, just came out back in the late spring, early summer of 2021, we get Eternal Hails. I actually reviewed this album back in the fall, and this is my number 3 album. Like, holy shit, like the production feels like a late 70s, early 80s album, and I love it. Like, it's back to the grit, back to the rawness, but the music is still very much classic heavy metal and doom metal influence, kind of like a continuation of Old Star a little bit, but bringing in, again, a little bit of the speed metal vibes, especially on Wake of the Awakened. That has that riff and the beat at the start of that song kind of brings back that Motorhead vibe. But songs like Hate Cloak, bringing in the Black Sabbath and the Celtic Frost vibes once again. And then even the final track in Lost Arcane City of Apocra, more of the Black Sabbath vibes. Like, this feels like blackened Black Sabbath, like the blackest Sabbath that has ever existed. And again, their big inspiration being Celtic Frost. You get so many Celtic Frost riffs all throughout this album. And this album kind of feels like a middle ground between like Panzerfaust and Old Star. So it feels like a combo of those two albums. And I think this was one of the best albums of 2021. And it's my number 3 ranked overall for Darkthrone. So yeah, wondering when they're going to do their 20th album, because they are one album away from having 20, which is a lot, but they've been consistent, putting out music every 2 to 3 years on average now, whereas back in the day they would put out one every year, it seemed like. But Nocturno and Fenris just love to be around writing music, jamming tunes, and being like, hey, you feel inspired? Let's actually write some music. Are you going to be drunk? Yeah, probably. So, yeah. Darkthrone, like I said, like you might get confused when you listen to one album from them and then another one, because you might get confused that you're listening to the same band, because there are so many different avenues of sound that you get with all these albums. But Darkthrone, they do whatever the hell they want and don't care if anybody disagrees with it or not. So, yeah. But anyways, thank you guys for watching this video, and this was fun because Darkthrone may be my favorite Norwegian black metal band of all time, and I look forward. I don't think the story is over for this band. I think they're going to continue as long as they're alive, and I look forward to what they got in store next. But what would you guys rank these albums? Let me know in the comments section below what your rankings of Darkthrone albums are. What's your favorite? What's your least favorite? I'd love to hear. What do you think is the most underrated album of their discography? But until next time, horns high, and I will see you soon.
Said Michael was the... Wait, how was Charles alive again?
I brought him back.
Oh.
Wait, I'm sorry, what? Huh?
Seth,
I didn't even know I was alive!
I didn't either. You brought him back as an innocent person? He's dead. I thought he was dead.
Damn it! Yes, everybody.
What happened?
Okay, what happened? Okay, let me
Why would
explain.
Charles survive?
Hold on, let me explain. So Charles was shooting at me. I killed him, and I bought the defibrillator, and I brought him back. But Seth killed him.
Again.
Seth killed him, and then I killed Seth.
Well, to be fair,